Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you may be. My name is Michelle Wonsley-Ford, and I am the Executive Director for the Center for Racial Justice and Education, based here in New York, but serving schools, school districts, and youth-facing organizations all across our country. I am so thrilled to welcome our esteemed panel of educators, administrators, scholars this evening to join me in conversation about the very real needs of education in the country at the moment, what we have been through, what we are going through, and what we might be dreaming of next. I would love to introduce each of our panelists by way of sharing with you their bios. And so I will start with Dr. Dia Bryant. Dia Bryant is the Interim Executive Director at the Education Trust in New York. She works closely with civil rights, business, and advocacy organizations to advance educational equity in the state of New York. Dr. Bryant previously worked as a special assistant to the first Deputy Chancellor in the New York City Department of Education, working on equity-focused instructional support to schools and strategy. She earned her doctorate at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she studied the history of Black education in America and school district leadership. While at Harvard, Dia worked as a teaching fellow in courses that focused on the intersections of leadership and race. She worked as a fellow in the DataWise project in reimagining integration, diverse and equitable schools. Dia also facilitated professional learning for some of the country's largest school systems with the Public Education Leadership Project at Harvard Business School. Before Dr. Bryant's time in graduate school, she founded and led Vista Academy in East New York, Brooklyn. Prior to her principalship, she served as an instructional coach, math teacher in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Dia's passion for equity in education came about when she discovered that math had answers when life did not, as a young child in Detroit, Michigan. She holds a BA in economics from Kalamazoo College, a master's in math education from Brooklyn College, and a doctorate in education leadership from Harvard University. Dr. Bryant, welcome. You're welcome. Dr. Melanie Dillett-Dukes is passionate about creating brave spaces for diverse groups of people to engage in discussions, empower action, and create change. With 20 plus years in the educational arena, Melanie has taught school-age children from preschool to high school, founded her nonprofit creative community to ignite student voices, coached teachers on culturally relevant pedagogy, designed curriculum, analyzed statewide data systems, and facilitated diversity, inclusion, and equity workshops for adult professionals. In 2020, she launched her educational consulting company, Beyond Free LLC, to continue her work in liberatory practices within and outside of the educational arena. Dillett-Dukes is currently serving on the board for Teachers for Good Trouble, assisting with fostering the knowledge of educators from across the nation and advocating for social justice within the educational arena. She has recently joined the board for Between the Vote, an organization designed to engage students in civic discussions and actions. Dr. Dillett-Dukes graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Education from Spelman College, Masters of Education from Teachers College, Columbia University, an education doctorate in International and Transcultural Studies with a specialization in family and community as educator. As a lifelong learner, she engaged in an intense training on cognitive-based compassion training, CBCT, through Emory University, and has been an equity facilitator fellow through CREATE's equity program. Welcome, Dr. Dukes.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, and finally, our last panelist, Dr. Danielle Moss. Dr. Danielle R. Moss brings over 20 years of experience in college access and education to Oliver Scholars, a 35-year-old educational nonprofit that identifies high-achieving Black and Latinx students for admission to selective independent day and boarding schools and supports them through graduation from competitive colleges. A vocal proponent of expanded educational access for underserved communities, she previously served as the inaugural Chief of Staff of the New York Civil Liberties Union as the second Black woman to serve as President and CEO of the YWCA of the City of New York in its 150 plus history, and as the award-winning CEO of the Harlem Educational Activities Fund for 10 years. She was appointed by Mayor de Blasio to New York City's Commission on Gender Equity and serves on the board of the directors of the New York Women's Foundation. Her contributions to education in the social sector have been recognized by the New York State Education Department and the New York City Comptroller's Office, among others. In 2015, the Network Journal named her one of the 25 most influential Black women in business. In the summer of 2016, she was featured in the New York Times Corner Office column and in Crain's New York. Dr. Moss has contributed to the Daily Beast, the Huffington Post, Edutopia, the Amsterdam News, and City Limits magazine. Her 2018 TED Talk on student potential has garnered over 1.9 million views. She holds MA and Masters of Education degrees from Teachers College, Columbia University, where she also completed her doctorate in organization and leadership with a focus on education administration. She received her BA from Swarthmore College with a degree in both English literature and history with a concentration in Black studies. Welcome, Dr. Moss. So as you can see, we have a collection of fairly accomplished educators, first and foremost, right? And what I love about this group is that each of us has spent time in the classroom. I, the least among the four of us, mostly, as an administrator and a consultant to educators and administrators through leadership development. But, you all bring with you a rich and diverse slate of experiences and perspectives. And I am delighted to have you in conversation with us. For the benefit of those who are joining us virtually via the webinar, we will be accepting questions via our Q&A function. You may submit them there, and we will be moderating those questions to pose to our panelists once we have completed the prepared questions as the front part of the program. So with that, I will begin. So there were questions that I sent along, full disclosure, to our panelists just to sort of get us started relative to this conversation. And in the title, the subject of discussion this evening, we talked about future dreaming. Well, there is sort of a kissing cousin, so to speak, of future dreaming, freedom dreaming, that I asked you all to reflect on, which comes from Dr. Bettina Love's book, We Want to Do More Than Survive. And so she describes freedom dreaming in that book as dreams grounded in a critique of injustice. These dreams are not whimsical, unattainable daydreams. They are critical and imaginative dreams of collective resistance. These freedom dreams drive out apathy, and the quest for freedom becomes an internal desire necessary to preserve humanity. So given this focus on critique that Dr. Bettina Love and frankly, Robin D.G. Kelley in his book, Freedom Dreams, discuss and both point to, what do you believe has been sort of the greatest failing of public education in the last several years, be it locally, wherever you happen to be, or nationally? And to kick us off, I will start with you, Dr. Bryant.
Whoa, I got the mic first. Well, it's great to be with you ladies tonight. Really an honor to be with you and to be in the fight with you too. So, I mean, Michelle, that's a tough one, right? So I spent a lot of time thinking about where would I hedge my bet, right? And so I think during the pandemic, we've talked quite a bit about, there's lots of different ways folks are saying it. They're saying learning loss, they're saying instructional loss, unfinished instruction. I think, why didn't we have this conversation before the pandemic? Because suspensions have been doing this, right? We know that when children are suspended from school, they experience instructional loss. It is a loss of seat time. And when we talk about what that means, particularly in New York, outside of New York City, Black students make up about 10% of enrollment, and they account for nearly 31% of all suspensions. Within New York City, Black students make up about 23% of all students, but they account for 50% of all suspensions being suspended once. And then we can go into the gender, where we talk about girls are 6 times as likely, particularly Black girls, when compared to their white counterparts. And in some areas of the state, it's almost 8 times. Black girls are almost 8 times as likely to be suspended. And that's instructional loss. Not only is that instructional loss, we are not actually having conversations with children about how to verbally engage about what they're feeling, or talk about, what it is they're actually going through that puts them in sort of the precarious situation of having to be suspended, right? Or having these punitive measures. So that's one. I mean, I could go on, advanced coursework, all of those things, but, that's one that I think, everyone's, and we should be up in arms about the amount of instructions our children have lost given remote learning and all the different things. But we were losing before. And I'm afraid that there are measures in place that we may be losing now, and we just don't know about them. And what happens when we reopen? Are we going back to the same old where, children are being suspended from school 20 and 30 days at a time? We've got to do better. So that would be my big bet right there.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Bryant. Dr. Moss, Dr. Dukes.
I tell you, Dr. Bryant, yes. And before I start, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I am so honored to be around these beautiful women, the queens, and just to be among all the accomplishments. I'm so impressed and just honored to be here. I thank you, Michelle, for giving me this opportunity. When Dr. Bryant was speaking, we were chatting before, and one of the greatest failings, and it's a big one, which is deeply connected to what Dr. Bryant just spoke on, was the discipline pieces. The greatest failing is the fact that nationally, we as a nation have not confronted the atrocities of what we've done to Indigenous peoples, as well as the enslavement of people. And when we don't recognize those pieces, then it trickles down into the curriculum that we feed our children, to the teachers that we are told what to teach, the histories. And I know Baldwin spoke of that, right? The deepest failing is not recognizing the history of America and what they have done. And that in itself, when we are not training our teachers about the history, we're not really knowing about who we are, then we're not really connecting to our students. We're not really understanding the conflict, the traumas that have been endured for the past 400 years, along with the systems that are continued in place to push out our students, to criminalize and to continue the pipeline, right? The school to prison pipeline. So I know that's huge and big, but that's paramount. If we as a nation cannot say officially, we apologize for the atrocities and we are going to give reparations, break those treaties with Indigenous people, it does not allow them access to simple things of water. They have to, just basic access that they are striving for in a nation that's supposed to be so wealthy. But because the United States does not want to face the realities and their cruel history, we are failing our education system because it's all intertwined, it's woven together. So that's where I feel like our deepest failing, and it extends way back than 10 years, but it's the foundation. And so that's how we're moving in this society, because we're not deeply connecting to each other in the way that we should in order to heal and be free and have that liberation that we need to move forward and grow.
Thank you so much for all of your comments. Like my co-discussants, I'm very grateful to Michelle for this opportunity. One of the things I always say to my staff is that everything we have and everything about how we do this work, somebody literally just made it up. We talk about systems, we talk about institutions, we lean into our institutional memory, but for real, somebody just sat down at a desk and just made this whole thing up, right? And so the challenge I always put forth is invent something else. You know what I'm saying? All these institutions that are struggling with racial equity and diversity, I believe that we are 5 major decisions away from turning the tide on all of this, right? Are we brave enough to name those 5 decisions to make those 5 decisions, that's a different conversation. But there's so much intellectual capital that's going into this whole idea of racial equity and education. Like we have the knowledge that we need to figure this out. And so I think that's like the foundation that we need to start with and hold ourselves accountable in that space. When I came to Oliver Scholars, right, we identified gifted and talented Black and Brown kids from the New York City public school students and helped them gain access to independent schools. You know, one of the pushbacks I got and continue to get sometimes is, well, why are you helping those kids? Those kids were going to be fine anyway. And what we know is that Black and Brown kids are 60% less likely to be even referred for gifted education. And even when their scores are absolutely identical to white and Asian students, they are still 23% less likely to be referred for gifted education. And the number one reason, teacher bias. Simply because someone who probably doesn't look like those students, right? Because I think in 2010, 70% of all new teachers in New York were white, looks at our kids and doesn't see the possibilities for them. And I can't accept that there's not something we can do about that, right? So like my cousin works in a school district where everyone is tested for gifted education, right? Not just the parents who can finagle with the principal or hire a tutor or, you know, live in the right zip code. You know, that's something we can do something about, right? I've had groups of 7th and 8th grade students petition their superintendent to say, why can't I have algebra in 8th grade if I'm ready for algebra in 8th grade, right? These are decisions that people are making on a regular basis. You know, it's one thing to say our kids can't excel on the specialized high school exam in New York City. It's another thing to ask the kids to take a test on material they've never even seen because the content that they have access to is not competitive or rigorous, regardless of whether or not they're ready to tackle new subjects. So I think there are some things around how we finance schools, how we staff schools, you know, these disciplinary issues, like somebody is in a position to tomorrow say, we ain't doing that no more. So, right, so how do we find out that person's name and email address and blow up the spot, right? So this idea that, oh, woe is me, I don't know nothing about birthing no babies. We absolutely know what to do. We do it for the kids that we care about, right? And we need to do something different. And we need to build some accountability around this. You know, I hate a point and blame culture, but like if I can oppress you with no consequences and continue to position my community and people who look like me for disproportionate advantage, this moral imperative that we're waiting to magically appear is not going to happen, right? And so I think we need to grapple with that. You know, a lot of the independent school kids this past summer were involved in a movement. We call it the Black At movement. But there are a lot of competitive public schools that were also included in the Black At movement. Some of this behavior by educators is absolutely egregious. To me, it was, my God, it was like child abuse, right? And so people are leaning in, they want to hire a DEI director, they want to hire a consultant. Who are you going to fire as a consequence of what I feel was like abuse of students of color? Like some of the comments made by faculty and staff. There are no consequences, right? So where's the part where you interrupt the behavior and redirect the behavior? because this is, systems are people. Institutions are just like people who come to work just like we do, and put on their shoes one at a time, just like we do. So, I'm not willing at this point to, we know what the history of this country is. We should be teaching the real history of this country, right? Someone wrote a whole article about basically alternative facts in textbooks, right? So you're not just miseducating Black and brown kids, you're miseducating white kids and everybody else who we're expecting to participate in a civil society. And we're expecting that to happen. Well, no, do we really want it to happen? Because I could go into a whole other thing about Isabel Wilkerson's cast, right?
Right.
There's, for all the education on this panel, let's start telling the stories about all the times that we were discounted, disrespected, underpaid, overlooked. And all that paper, all those accolades wasn't enough to overcome our being relegated to the lowest rung on the social strata in America. And if you can't have that conversation, we're just gonna keep going in circles. Somebody's gonna be murdered. There's gonna be a whole big uprising. Everybody's gonna issue a statement. A couple of people will get jobs but have no power and no budget or resources. And then we'll be right back here next summer or the summer after that to have the same conversation again. So I don't want to monopolize, but.
All right, Dr. Moss.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that that you just touched on, Dr. Moss. Well, first of all, in the Q&A, someone has said, I hope that we hear Dr. Moss's 5 major decisions that that she would put forth, which, kind of leads us into this next idea of, you mentioned that those major decisions demand a certain level of bravery, right? And I am transported back to, I guess, just last Wednesday when Amanda Gorman, who is our young poet laureate, presented the inaugural poem, The Hill We Climb, right? And the last few lines of that poem, there is always light if we are brave enough to see it, if we are brave enough to be it, right? And so, to your point, the disruption, the dismantling, the new imagining, the freedom dreaming that needs to happen, right? That is both about critique and then also about creativity. That is rooted in bravery, because we have just come through a historic inauguration where we have welcomed Joseph Biden as our new president, former vice president of the United States, and also Kamala Harris as the first, yes, as our first woman vice president, woman elected to the highest offices in the land. She is also Black, she is also Indian, and she is a child of immigrants. And so, that moment was historic for any number of reasons. But I am curious to know from you all, as you think about this incoming administration, and perhaps this does map to those 5 brave decisions, Dr. Moss, but what would they be best sort of positioned, or what should they be thinking about right now during this transition? It is, the time of what we have heard called the twin pandemics, right, of COVID and sort of institutional racism, visible at a level that it likely has not ever been in this country, right? And so, given those challenges, what might our new administration, not just in the executive branch, but in the other 2 branches as well, consider to sort of turn the tide?
I'll jump in here, and hopefully you ladies will jump in and carry for me. I think one of the things we've seen as a result of the pandemic was the amount of reliance we had on the public school system for childcare, right? It served as the de facto childcare system. And once folks were out of work, we kind of saw oh, whoa, this is what teachers do every day? Yeah, that's what we do every day. You're gonna hear my 4-year-old, he's just loud. But now it is no longer just the woman's problem. I mean, I remember having my 2 children and being so worried about okay, I spent most of my maternity leave coordinating, trying to figure out who was going to watch the kid, where was I going to get the stuff, how was I going to keep things together and float the household at the same time. That's a lot. And for a long time, we've put that on women only. I think what the pandemic has shown us is this is everybody's problem. Because if we don't have childcare, businesses can't open. We need reliable workforce. And I think that in this particular moment, we need to be thinking about, what does universal childcare look like? Why are people paying 30% of their salary toward childcare? To me, that makes almost no sense when these are contributing citizens to our sort of broader economy. And if we're going to recover properly, I think we've got to put some serious thought into it. I think that's where I would start. I mean, I also have lots of ideas and issues around like community schools and why context matters and why communities matter, their aspirations, the things that they want to accomplish, no longer this sort of parachuting in and telling you what your problems are and here's how you solve them. Like, I think we need to really consider and think through, what do communities like Brownsville want? What do communities like Rochester, New York want? What do they need? What are they aspiring to? What do they want their children to be in the world? What do they want their contribution to be? And those are serious conversations we've never had. And so I think we've got to find a way to bubble that up so that that's driving our work, right? We're always sort of data driven. I think we got to shift a little bit and be community driven and data informed, right? And that's just, I guess that's sort of the top of the dome, like where I'm thinking about that. Let you all jump in.
Yeah, I'd love to, Bryant. Absolutely. The pandemic has illuminated so many things that should have been brought out a long time ago. I mean, this is something that, when we say the race war and everything else, the pandemic, oh my gosh, there's such disparities. It's been there, right? It's just at the forefront because we know white people have suffered from it as well. So all of a sudden, it's a serious issue. We know that's the fact of the matter. Two of the things, and mine is always going to just go back to race. It's going to keep on looping back. When we speak of redlining neighborhoods and funding of schools, that's my top. One of the things is, how are we funding schools based on the location of your school? It should be more of an equitable base. What does your school need? And that's where the funds will go, not to states or areas where we know they have been relegated to rich areas and they keep out people who cannot afford to be in that area. They don't provide transportation to that area, so they can't live in that area. So definitely focusing on how we fund our public school education is of utmost importance in providing that. The second thing that really has been at the forefront for myself, and especially in the work I do with Teachers for Good Trouble, is pushing for mental health care for teachers. We always do talk about the mental health, of course, social emotional learning for students, which is, of course, that's woven into the curriculum. But however, we tend to neglect the need for our teachers. Teachers are bearing the weight of their own personal issues, then their children's issues, 25, 36, 40, whatever is in their classroom issues, then their children's families issues, right? And they are taking that home. And we are not paying attention to the allocation of how many counseling hours they are allotted, and bringing that up, bringing awareness. Because I think as Black folks, we kind of just push through it. Oh, it's okay. We're just going to get through it. This is what we do. And that's what it is within the education arena. Teachers tend to say, oh, that's what I do. Just like spending money on gifts, spending money on, things for their students. When that could be the last of their money, we are going to give back to our students because we care. There's that empathy. And we do for them more than we do for ourselves. And that's why I think teachers struggle with self-care. And doing what they need to do for themselves. And that's why we're the most, the group that is taken advantage of the most. They know that we're going to do it for the kids. So they're going to keep on pushing and not provide us with the care that we need. That was the main two that I feel like is a great push. And of course, the obvious, teacher salary scales to be increased so that teachers don't have to hustle for 2-3 jobs on top of what they're already doing in the classroom. I mean, it all loops into the funding of schools. So with the salaries and then mental health, we need to do better. We need to do better. And Dr. Moss spoke on something about standardized testing or just testing period. And we know the biases and the cultural implications of that in itself, and what that comes from and where it's seeped from. And we have to reinvent that. Like, why are we even using a score, a mental ability score, that was based on times of making sure that people were desegregated and segregated and kept apart? Why are we still using a system that furthers the segregation of people? Even though we're in one building, I was speaking with Emory Business School students yesterday and having some conversation with them, sophomores. And they were talking about it was an affinity group of all white students. And one of the young gentlemen stated, he's like, yeah, I was in a school that was 90%, he's saying 70% Black. However, the AP classes that I was in was 90% white, right? But we know that. We know that's what we do. This is what the continuation of segregation and what it leads to in our students and our push and our drive when they feel like they're not capable of doing so. And they see it in the school. They see teachers being biased. They see teachers having favoritism because a white student will speak up and say something and they're assertive, right? But our Black students speak up, and because they're possibly not labeled gifted or in those AP classes, they're going to be labeled as being defiant. So, we have all these pieces when we're speaking of standardized testing. I can add that on to that administration. Like, look, we need alternative ways of assessing our babies, because this is not working for their mental health and for just the improvement of our nation. So, throwing it in there as well as something that, we have to reinvent. We have to reimagine, like Dr. Moss said. Somebody came up with a system to further oppression, right? We need to come up with a system for liberation and freedom practices. So I'm not going to keep, I could keep on going on this, but Dr. Boss, I know you probably have your points.
That was so great, so instructive. White supremacy is so powerful in New York City that you can have Asian students advocating to keep out Black and brown kids from the city's most rigorous public schools. That's the power of white supremacy. As you talk about all of these systems, I do a lot in the nonprofit sector. It is mind-blowing to me how well we as Americans have figured out how to modernize the antebellum plantation and basically every sector of life. What you got, medicine, what you got, education, what you got, finance. It's always the same big house, folks in the field model, right? That's how powerful the enemy of white supremacy is. And so, I can't even begin to think about like what are the 2 or 3 things that I would say to Kamala and Joe in terms of like the Department of Education. First of all, I'm like, I hope somebody was taking notes when Betsy DeVos was in there. So like everything she did, let's undo that. And then we'll start from, I was like, I hope somebody was paying attention. Part of that whole 4 years was to keep you completely on edge. Like I have so much trauma that inauguration, like everybody was like, oh, you can finally exhale. And I was like, I'm like still shaking. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm like waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? What a powerful strategy that was. That's all I can say. It worked on me. What would I say? Eliminate student debt, right? So I just read this study about how Black and brown college graduates don't get the full benefit of their education because we don't get paid commensurate with our white and Asian counterparts, right? And so the impact of educational debt on a Black or brown college graduate, that's money that you can't cycle back into the economy through home ownership and all these other things that you're delaying so that you can pay back these. I mean, the interest is enormous, and I can say this because I have a doctorate from Columbia, right? Okay, right? That we have to kind of like lean into. When my mother went to City College, right? She left Howard for financial reasons, and she went to City College in Harlem, and it was free, y'all. She was complaining that her book fee was $37.50. And I'm like, lady, I got real problems. I don't want to hear about all that, right? So what I'm saying is, also, like, supposedly for all the things that we want to see changed, all the things that have been proposed, we didn't have any money. And then COVID hit. And guess what?
We
Money
found the
is
money.
like falling from the sky. And it was just like, I thought we couldn't afford it. What happened to that story?
You've located
Right?
where money resides, Dr. Moss.
So there's also something about accountability around, you know, how do you show what you care about? What do you spend on? Where do you focus your resources? And we can't let people off the hook, and we can't accept, well, we can't afford it anymore, right? And so I think what we intend to happen, like, I don't want the kids in my program to do this extensive experience from the time they're in 7th grade and then be pushed to go to the most rigorous colleges and universities and then come out with like a sack of debt on their back. You know, when I know that a lot of our families are counting on our young people, not just to be transformed by their educational experience, there's an expectation that you're going to transform your family and transform your community. You know, we don't count as philanthropy the millions of dollars that we know people send back to the Caribbean and South America and all the other places that they come from, because it's not, you know, within our paradigm of what constitutes philanthropy. So there is enormous expectations for those of us who then do have opportunities to reach back and help. And sometimes that help expectation comes in the form of like financial expectations. So apparently we had all this money that we just like would not spend, right? And so I wish, and maybe there's an organization out there, like, who are the policy watchdogs who are looking at this with an equity anti-oppression lens in terms of like how we're spending money, how we're allocating resources, and then how are we holding public officials accountable? You know, Jennifer Jones Austin, who heads FPWA, her father was a minister, and she said something on a panel last week that really resonated with me. Freedom is the ability to call out a lie, right? And so that's some of what we're grappling, right? I'm a CEO of a nonprofit. I can be outspoken. There are moments when I feel like, maybe I shouldn't have said that, right? Because you don't want the consequences. You don't want people to not give you the grant. You don't want people to take away opportunities for your young people. But how do you make progress in an organization, in a system where people can't tell the truth and can be fired for telling the truth and can be pushed out of their jobs for telling the truth? I've been fired before, right? Because I'm a mirror for what's happening in my community. I didn't understand as a young person that wearing my dashiki, as I call it, has consequences, right? But there are consequences for truth tellers. Like, we don't talk about the fact that Linda Sarsour and Tarana Burke, they get death threats on a regular basis. They have to be careful about where their kids go to school. They've had to change schools. They've had to move. That's how we respond to truth tellers in this society. And so, but that's something that we can do something about. So I think, you know, sometimes we have a title, but we don't have the power and influence that come with the title. So we also have to balance that. How can we have the back of the people who are willing to go in those rooms and have those conversations, right? How do we insulate them so that they can be truth tellers? It's like everybody was like, Obama needs to do X, Y, Z. And then nobody voted in the midterm elections to give him the Congress he needed in order to be able to do some of the things that we wanted him to do. So I think figuring out how do we build a curriculum that's based on the truth, right? So every once in a while, there's an article in some journal about, you know, some southern state that has a textbook that talks about happy slaves. Dude, what are you talking about, right? And that's the messaging, right, that a whole generation, not just of Black and brown kids, are being exposed to, but we expect these white kids to come into the classroom and treat us like human beings when we have built a foundation that basically speaks to the opposite of that, right? And it's not just schools, right? It's like, why is the media overrepresenting Black people as representing poverty in the United States? 66% of the people living in poverty right now on tonight are white. And you would never know that turning on any, name a news outlet. And we don't own BET anymore. So, you know, so figuring out, like, if freedom is the ability to call out a lie, where do we create spaces for truth telling in our educational system, because we're really just making choices. We're not really facing up against anything that we can't solve. Like, to me, you know, when you have a school shooting in a white community, the therapists are like out in droves. They're there the next day. I can tell you, when I was CEO of the YWCA, I had kids in Brownsville who witnessed their friend be stabbed to death in an elevator. Those kids had to take the same damn elevator to get home every day after school. And where were the counselors and the grief folks at their institution of learning on a daily basis? They were nowhere to be found, you know? So it's like, we have to build the mental health space, not just for the kids, but as you said, also for the teachers. You know, I taught in the Bronx and Brooklyn. That is the hardest job I ever did. Keeping 30 or so 12-year-olds engaged in a meaningful activity or conversation for an entire, 8 hours a day? Like, that's some hard work, right? So how do we take care of them? I see the teachers showing up at Michael's craft store in droves in August so they can use their own personal money to make sure their bulletin boards look great, to make sure that everybody in that class has a pencil. But we didn't have any money. But in a pandemic, we suddenly magically materialize all these resources. So, you know, how do we keep those conversations on the table? How do we take on this whole issue of specialized high schools in New York City and not drop it? Like, somebody's got to be in a position to make a decision. You know, you shouldn't be able to be a D student and show up and do well on an exam one day and then tell my A student who doesn't test as well that they don't have anything to contribute to that school community.
All right.
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Dukes.
Yes, Dr. Moss, you said a lot, great points in everything, and I'm just absorbing it all. And I think one of the things that we have to do as educators is pull in our student voice. As we could see last summer, this generation, they're not playing, right? They are all about, I'm done, we're done. They're tired of my generation for not doing as much as we could have for them and just maintaining the status quo. Keeping up with the Joneses, right? They're done. So I think we really need to, instead of saying how can we, we are going to call in student voices. We are going to ask them, what do we do? What should we do? And have that commonality, because what I feel like in education, there's a great ageism going on. I know more, I'm the veteran, you're not supposed, that goes along with, I think it's a Black culture anyway, right? In the past, because my children talk when they want to talk. I've taught them to be critical thinkers and to, really push me. And I remember growing up, I would not open my mouth, just sit in the corner and just listen in. You just pretend like you're not even there, right? But now kids are taught and pushed to really have that independent thinking, or should be pushed in that way, because our Black children, when they do that, as I talked about before, they're seen as being defiant. So it all goes back to pulling them in, drawing them in. And that goes with when we talk about authentic learning experiences, having those learning projects that aren't these standardized tests, but it's more authentic. What are your interests, right? Drawing them in the process so they could have the system that they would better thrive in and not just survive, right? With Dr. Bettina Love, when she speaks on the thriving, we just don't want them going day to day and having to pay the bills and all of that. We want them to make sure that they are freedom dreaming and doing. So calling on the voices of our students, finding out from them, like what it is that, what can we support you on? I always say, we are just facilitators of learning. We're there to help them and assist them. And I don't pretend to know all of the histories of our world because it's been erased. But I will say, well, what voice is missing from here? What can we push for? What do you think is right or wrong? And even when we speak on, and when I was, like I said, when I was facilitating for the business kids, I was like, sometimes, people are not going to have that empathy, that attachment, and not going to care. I think you were talking about that too, Dr. Moss. Not going to care about, being moral or whatever it is. But what is the bottom line? If you want a successful business, right, what relationships are you going to build to make sure it's long lasting and you could be effective and productive? Let's just say that this Black and brown person has all of that for you. What systems are you going to be putting in place to make sure that person is feeling included, and not included because they're conforming to white supremacist ideologies, behaviors, but they're in the authentic selves and being productive, that type of inclusivity. So that's where, we really have to appeal to them and ask them, okay, here it is. There's logic and heart, right? Logically, okay, let's think logically about this, and then moving forward about our heart as well, and now doing. So, those are the things that I think we in this generation, or where you are, just calling on people, groups of people, to make sure that we're doing what we need to do for them.
Can I also add that, like, no one's waiting for us to save them? That's a paradigm that only lives within our own imaginations. And I'm going to give you an example, right? Because, the philanthropic space, the nonprofit space has, over the last 20 years, it's like, we want data, we want outcomes measures. I'm not anti-data, let me just say that, right? But, my friend Ana Oliveira at the New York Women's Foundation says that there has to be a sense of urgency about our philanthropy. And she always says that she worries that philanthropy has lost that sense of urgency. So I was talking to my friend's niece. She lives in North Carolina. And every once in a while in a conversation, she was about 10 years old at the time, she would reference like her play grandma. Oh, my play grandma said this. Oh, my play grandma said that. So finally I was like, okay, I need to know more about this magical play grandma. So tell me how this works. So she's like, well, play grandma lives on my block, and we go to her school. We go to her house after school. She gives us a snack, and then we spend an hour doing homework, and then we play in her yard. Once you're in her yard, you don't go wandering the neighborhood. You have to stay there until your parents get home. And she takes care of us. She talks to us. I was like, sis is running an after school program, right? Sis is probably retired. She ain't got no grant. She don't have no outcomes measures, right? She's not pulling no data. She saw a need in her community, because that's how we roll, and she's working to address that need. And so, what I say to my young people is, of course, there's something amazing about wherever you come from, because you're here, right? And so we have to figure out, like, how do we support initiatives without needing to own, manage, and control the conversation in communities that we don't belong to? That is not the American way, right? The idea that you could come into a community, see what's going on, and say, you know what, y'all got this. Here's $100,000 to make it happen. right? I've never been one to, I've been approached in different roles to say, oh, this organization is doing great. You guys should go national. You should have one in Detroit. You should have one in Chicago. I'm like, nobody's waiting for me in Chicago. I'm not from Chicago. I'm not from Detroit. We have not solved for educational inequality in New York City, the city of my birth. And so how can we figure out how to be in conversation with community without this need to like control the dialogue and the direction?
Well, that goes right back to, what Dr. Bryant was saying about being, community driven and data informed, right? There was a question about that came up relative to kind of parsing that out. And I think, Dr. Moss, you just drew the distinction for folks, right? It means to enter a space upon invitation and to ask questions only after listening, right? And it is, there's something about it that is, that requires humility, right? And it requires that the folks who have the problems likely know what the solutions are, right? And so it is not about coming in and imposing those solutions. One of the things I want to call out is that it is 7:26. We did tell folks that they would have the opportunity to ask questions, and questions they have. They have been steadily rolling in while you have been in conversation. And I know that this conversation was slated to end at 7:30. There also have been a number of questions asked relative to whether or not this will be recorded. It is being recorded, and it will be shared later this week on the CRJE site and other outlets. And so for those of you who have had to drop off, you'll probably see this later. But for those of you who are on, if you missed something, if you have thoughts that have come to you and you need to be reminded, the recording will be available. It is 7:27, and so I do want to pull out a question which I think is extremely pertinent to this conversation. And I think, frankly, some of the questions are very specific about specific programming in New York City, for example, relative to things that are happening here, things that are happening in other local geographic spaces. But this question of what your freedom dreams are, and you all have kind of alluded to this with the ideas that you shared, the issues that you've highlighted, but I would love, in the words of one of my predecessors, Benny Vasquez, who is one of the past EDs of the Center for Racial Justice and Education, I would love if we could keep this crisp and core and share with our community that has joined us this evening what your freedom dreams are for kids across this country. We know even with the things that they are struggling with, there is still an extraordinary amount of joy and optimism and freedom dreaming that they are doing for themselves. But what are your dreams for our kids across the country?
I'll jump in here. I think a lot about messaging. And my biggest dream is that our children can learn to abandon it. Abandon the sort of negative messaging that they get about who they must become and who they will be in the world. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan in the 80s. I really shouldn't have to say any more than that, but I grew up in a house where we had no heat, no hot water. My parents had very, 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 very little. But there was something about my environment that helped me understand that anything was possible, right? Because if it got this bad, it could actually get much better. And so we need to think about sort of the messages that are being delivered to us about who we are, where we live, what we can do, right? And I hope that we can instill in our children that they can abandon all of those and write whoever they want to be in the world for themselves. And so that's my dream.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant.
I was joking with a friend of mine that I want to see a Black movie about nothing. So I saw this Sarah Jessica Parker movie. I'm gonna bring it down. Right. I'm gonna try to be crisp. And basically the movie is just like a white woman going about her life. You know what I'm saying? Like just chilling. She's got a boyfriend, he's got a family. There's not really a clear plot. Like she is just allowed to exist in her space, in her skin. And I was like, that's my dream, right? For all of our kids to not have to be able to travel this country without negotiating, you know, where am I going to stay? Oh my God, I hope my car doesn't break down because the cops might, you know, not be as friendly as I would expect them to. Like, to be able to just move about freely, to be able to soar if you want to, and to be able to just chill if that's your thing, and not to participate in the hyper productivity culture without judgment, without feeling like you disappointed someone. Just to like be, to like dismantle the caste system and give people the freedom to decide the information they need to make choices without this racialized oppression calculus that we all still negotiate every time I go into a building, every time I go into a store. You know, I still get followed. Like, let's be real. Nobody cares what school I went to, right? And so like just this idea to be able to imagine freely about who I am and how I enter spaces without fear of retribution or consequence. And the ability, like Jennifer said, her father said, you know, to call out a lie when you see it.
Thank you. Yeah, freedom dreaming, I tell you, I do that all the time, just on what I want the future generation, our Black and brown babies, to do is walk in their true authentic selves without worrying about what people have to say and what people are going to say or think of them. Just like Dr. Moss was stating, you know, being able to move freely in this world, and not having to navigate it and just be completely liberated, even without not even racial, but gender issues and conformities that we have in this world. We need to make sure that these babies are in that place of freedom and being liberated. I know I'm hopeful because this next generation, I tell you, they're pushing forward. They're pushing it. They're pushing it. My daughter and my son push me consistently, and I'm grateful for that because it gives me such hope. And we just have to accept it, and not only accept it but embrace it. Right? There's a complete difference. But freedom to be your authentic, true self in this world, without repercussion, without any systems there to continue to oppress. So that's my freedom dreaming.
I love this. I love this. I will, because I feel, frankly, obligated as the ED of CRJE to share a freedom dream as well. But I am, you know, very excited to share with you all, this group, and then those who are watching and listening in, that, you know, the Center for Racial Justice and Education was founded almost 20 years ago as border crossers to engage young people of different races who are having different academic experiences and conversation to better understand why those disparities exist. And of course, because we as adults, I like to call us the big heads in the building, we love kids, and as educators, you know, folks wanted to support the young people having these conversations. And then as families, they wanted to be able to be in conversation with young people and with educators. And so we went down this path of training and development and working across racial lines with diverse groups of educators and administrators to figure out how to dismantle racism. But we will be returning a bit to our origin story, to center youth leadership and developing a youth-adult partnership in a program that is, I think, aptly named for Ella Baker, who of course saw the leadership potential in young folks as a person who led young people at SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so that program will be piloted this spring. And we are very excited. We've got a couple of academic institutions, schools that are excited to be in conversation with us about what that might look like. And of course, some community partners that we are reaching out to because our work with youth is a little dusty. So I will be talking to each of you as well. One thing I do want to share is for those of you on the line who want to learn more about the things that Dr. Bryant, Dr. Dukes and Dr. Moss have spoken about. We call this critical analysis. Everything they have shared with us this evening is rooted in what CRJE calls critical analysis. We do have a training coming up this weekend, and so if you go to our website, you can check that out and register. We will be hosting them regularly, as we have been for several years at this point. Everything is virtual for now, but we hope to be in person again as soon as it feels safe for everyone. I want to extend a warm thank you to each of our panelists for your candor, for your insight, for your intellect, for each of you that have participated, that have asked your questions. I think that we will see if we can figure out how to get some of these answered and posted, but there will be, again, the recording of this evening live. With that, I thank each of you for attending, and we at the Center for Racial Justice and Education wish each of you well. Thank you.